Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome back to the podcast and the YouTube channel. Sal Vetri here, and we're going to take a first look, and this is a very cursory first look. I have some interests, if you will, sorted out here on this spreadsheet, but first look, we're 11 days away from the Super Bowl. Don't worry, we'll have a lot more coverage on this Showdown slate and the Super Bowl. I'll be doing a video. I'll be on some other shows, but I'll also be doing a video on some of the player props that I like that stand out sometime next week, closer to the games when we have all the official statuses of some players, some key players like Tevin Coleman, the main one, how that impacts the rest of the running backs, how that impacts the entire offensive game plan for these teams going into it. So some of that stuff, as I break down into it more, we'll have the final thoughts for the Showdown. So just showing you what's coming for the Super Bowl. There'll be a live stream, there'll be a show on the betting on the prop side of it, and then there'll be a final thought show after this one. Maybe a higher level strategy show for Showdown, just because of the interest that will be here for the Super Bowl. But if you're tuning me in on this one, I have the salaries loaded up here. I have my interest filtered. I do not have the normal in-depth analysis that will be on the final thoughts one that will be probably sometime next week. But welcome if you are new. This video is sponsored by FantasyDraft, the rake-free, the revolutionizing the way, the mecca of daily fantasy sports, if you will. FantasyDraft changing the way that you play, saving 15 to 30% of your lifetime rake by going to FantasyDraft, or at least getting some action over there. Also, just not a spot where a lot of pros are going heavy on yet, because not the biggest of prize pools, and hard to manage a lot of sites, especially on day-to-day types of games like maybe NBA, NHL, MLB when that runs back around. So be sure to check out FantasyDraft. There's a link down below, but down below in the description. You can check that out. It does help me if you just click the link, but I do encourage you to actually check out what FantasyDraft has to offer. Linked down below is their lobby as well. So, Showdown slate, Super Bowl. Look, there's going to be a lot of strategy. There's going to be a lot of ways that you can try and convince yourself that you're knowing it the right way. At the end of the day, I think that the way that Draftkings has priced this Showdown slate, and I'm not too much of a fan of the FanDuel slate and how that they go with the 1.5x and whatever it is, you have to rank pretty much two captains in a descending order of total multipliers. What I like from this Showdown slate, and it is difficult. Last year was the wildest of all things when you had Brian Jester win the $1 million, when you just need Julian Edelman and then a bunch of kickers, defenses, right? No offense in that game when you were expecting a lot of offense with the Rams on the field and the Patriots to an extent not having the defense that they had this year. Now you have a situation where we don't know what to expect. A nice total, pretty much a pick 'em at this point, a 1-point spread in a lot of places. And DraftKings did a damn good job pricing everybody either appropriately or pricing them up for certain situations if somebody was to miss, and then just in general probably overpricing some players, which makes it even more difficult. I don't really see a lot of value that screams out that is a fantastic play. Now, I think there's a couple of good options because they're cheap, but nowhere near that's a slam dunk play. He's starting in my Showdown lineup, like you've had a lot of the times on a lot of these Super Bowl slates, the first one last year. It might have been the second one last year, but in a lot of just Showdown slates throughout the year where there was $100 all the way up to $400,000 prize pools at times. Now with $1 million on the line, and I think there's two different millionaire makers, it's going to be interesting to see lineup construction. I have been quoted this year saying that when I play Showdown slates, I rarely will play a quarterback that is $12,000 or above. I have yet to do it outside of Lamar Jackson on his 2 Showdown slates, and look, it's just extremely unique when a guy who's going to run and throw and usually be the only top producer on the entire slate in those games, at least it was. It's hard to ignore him even if he is $13K plus. That's not the case this week with Patrick Mahomes. Like I see him as the highest priced player. All these are utility salaries, not the captain slot. But $12,600 for Mahomes seems steep. And look, I get it. The week that he was $12,000 plus in the regular season, he got hurt. I got very lucky that I had 0% of him. I take aggressive stances on these showdowns. If you play it safe, you're either going to min cash some of your lineups. Maybe one pops off a little bit, but you're probably not winning the $1 million. So in spots like this, if Patrick Mahomes on a showdown slate where there's a ton of casuals playing the millionaire maker, in any other contests, as an early look at 12-6, I'm fine saying that I feel okay getting to 0% of Patrick Mahomes. Now, before everybody's heads explode and say, you don't like Patrick, no, I like him. This is a game theory play where he's 12,600. He is a quarterback. And look, if Patrick Mahomes has a big day, probably Kelsey or Hill, one of them are going to have a big day. They're both expensive. Kelsey, 9,600. Hill, 11,000. So getting to all three, getting to two of them might even be difficult, especially if you're going to captain one of them. And on a slate where you're facing the number one pass defense, yes, they finished the year slightly ahead of, if you're talking about secondary coverage, the New England Patriots. In the San Francisco 49ers, with the defensive line that they have, a top 5 pressure unit, the offensive line for the Chiefs has been improved, but it's a spot that I do think the 49ers match up fine. And it doesn't mean to the extent where Mahomes is just going to get shut down. There was a stat that came out that the 3 mobile quarterbacks that the 49ers have faced this year, Lamar Jackson, Russell Wilson twice. They have a combined rating of around 74 against this team. Everybody else is like in the 38 range, quarterback rating. It's atrocious. Mahomes, without a doubt, has looked a lot more mobile since the knee injury, which you didn't think you would see this year. He has. You saw the big 20-plus yard touchdown in the AFC Championship game against the Titans. It's a spot where he does have that upside in him. So when there are guys above $12,000, I consider them more, one, depending on the slate, is there other top-tier options? Are there other cheap options to make me feel comfortable getting to Mahomes, especially do they correlate? And I think the answer to that is yes. You have Mahomes, you have DeMarcus Robinson at 2,600. I don't love it, but you have McCole Hardman, another option at 2,200. They correlate, they're cheap, they allow you to get Mahomes into your lineup. But after that, you're looking at $7,000 Sammy Watkins, and then like we talked about, Hill and Kelsey at 9,600 and 11,000 respectively. It makes it a little bit more difficult. But there are options. I'm not saying that there's no way, and heck, anybody can play Mahomes. I personally just feel more comfortable if I imagine he comes in at 50, 60% ownership, even at this price tag. And trust me, quarterbacks go over-owned all the time, especially in the captain spot. You might get Mahomes in there 15, 20% ownership in the captain spot. It's just not anything I have any interest in the captain spot. I will definitely be coming in below the field on Mahomes based on this cursory first look, depending on what injuries and any type of game plans that we can kind of think up more throughout the week as I do the final thoughts video. Tyreek Hill, I would have a lot more interest in putting him in my captain spot, but he's also expensive. I have a lot more interest in him overall, but he's also going to be facing his most difficult task yet this entire season with the San Francisco 49ers secondary. I imagine bracket coverage, one of the best bracket coveraging teams in the entire league, if not the best this season, outside of maybe the Patriots, who might have had a little bit better personnel with McCourty when he was healthy and J.C. Jackson compared to the Mosleys and the Witherspoons. That is going to be the depth behind Richard Sherman. Still, Mosley, though, been fantastic for the 49ers. Their number 2 cornerback has jumped ahead of Witherspoon. It's a spot where Hill does stand out a little bit more than Mahomes for me. And then you start going down. All these Chiefs are wildly expensive in a game where they probably have a more difficult time scoring than usual, or at least that's what I'm thinking right now. And maybe that's not the way to think. Maybe I have to force myself to be more contrarian, because you saw last year the exact, 5-10% of the time at most that game scores the way that it actually scores between the Patriots and Rams. But those are things that if you're on that 5 to 10% of the outcome, where people are only on it 1% of the time, you're clearly going to be live for a top finish. So I do like Hill to Mahomes right now, and I don't think that I feel as if Mahomes will still be popular at this price tag. And I'm okay getting away from that. We'll see as the week goes on. Maybe that won't be the case depending on what content looks like. Tyreek Hill seems fine. Damian Williams again seems fine. A guy who's going to touch the ball 16 times, 18 maybe, depending on how this game goes. The 49ers defensive line, if anything, they struggle bottom third of the league in tackling. Some injuries are going to affect that now with Quan Alexander and Dee Ford seemingly going to be completely healthy by the time the Super Bowl rolls around 11 days from now. It makes Williams not as appealing, a top 10 run defense in the 49ers, but you can get yours, especially if you're a pass-catching back on these linebackers. It's a spot that's probably the best advantage for most teams attacking this short intermediate range of the 49ers. But the Kansas City Chiefs have other plans. When you have the weapons of the Hardmans, the Hills, the Kelseys, and you can attack anybody downfield, it's really going to be enjoyable, and I'm happy these two teams are in it. You have power offense versus power defense. So Damian Williams, we'll see how much of a priority he is. He's just so live to score touchdowns the way that they use him, not only in the red zone, but on big plays as well in both the running and passing game. Somebody that I have some interest in, but not a ton. As I look down this slate a little bit more, you have Raheem Mostert at 9,400 and Travis Kelce at 96. Kelce so far probably stands out the most for me. His matchup downfield is something that I think you're going to see this team take advantage of. He's not like Kittle on the other side who can just disappear like he has the first 2 games of the season, because they go very run heavy, which is another format that you might actually see this week. Even if they try and stop it, the Packers are overloading the box. Kyle Shanahan's running schemes are just so good in advance, and the number 1 running schemes in the entire league, that it didn't matter. Even with Raheem Mostert and Tevin Coleman going down, Mostert was still able to just absolutely destroy a team that was stacking the box against him the whole game. Unreal what that offensive line was able to do in the play calling schemes, just misdirections, creating confusion, deception, all of that is what he was doing. So yeah, Mostert at 9,400. If Tevin Coleman is out, is somebody I have interest in, is somebody that I'm completely fine getting to. And I'm not shocked just because, they've done it the first 2 games to Minnesota and Green Bay, that now you're going to have to go to the Jimmy G 35 pass attempt game. I'm not shocked to see Jimmy G throw 20 times, 18 times, and then continue to run the ball, which is their number 1 advantage here against this Kansas City Chiefs defense, improving both in the running game and the passing game of the Chiefs, but still the biggest advantage is on the ground. You have 2 weeks to scheme for it. You imagine they're going to try and take away Mostert or Coleman. Coleman right now dislocated, I believe it was shoulder. He is said to be a questionable. I don't know which way it's leaning. We don't have much news on it as of right now, but questionable. He is at 6,400. I'm not expecting him to play, so I have him as a no right now. But Mostert, I do think is surely in play. I think he sees a lot of work in this game. The game's going to stay close enough for him to touch the ball 16 to 18 times. If anything, though, if I had to guess, he's one of the guys who I would say is a little bit overowned. There was a game plan where Matt Breida really wasn't supposed to be involved in that game. Tevin Coleman goes down. If Coleman doesn't play in this game, I think Matt Breida will be more heavily involved. Some Jeff Wilson will probably be active as well. If Coleman does play, well, then Coleman will be more heavily involved. So I think that you're paying a price tag for Mostert for him to be the main back, when I think either way, Coleman will be active, and even if he's not, I think Breida will get more work than he did last week just because of having 2 weeks to scheme Breida back into the offense where he was just working as a 8-snap type of player before that, wasn't needed to take on a huge role as Mostert was ready to do. So I do think Mostert's fine, but at this price point as of right now, if he does pick up ownership after the last big game, I'm fine coming in under that. So I don't have any rankings on here yet. I will put the rankings for the final thoughts. I will put all my notes for it and have a more definitive answer. But from the 9K and above range, the guy who stands out to me the most is probably Travis Kelce here. And then it's very close between Tyreek Hill and Damian Williams after that for me. It's just really hard. DraftKings, once again, price these guys very appropriately. I think Mahomes is, for the matchup, without a doubt, overpriced for a showdown slate. I think Hill is appropriately priced. I think Damian Williams is appropriately priced. Kelce appropriately priced. Mostert slightly overpriced. So you're not getting any sort of discount currently. You get to this next range here, and here's the problem with Kittle. And somebody mentioned to me in a live stream, and they were absolutely right, and I should have thought more about it. Is Kittle going to be impacted in that Packers game by them just trying to run the ball nonstop? And I thought he would, but not enough to the point where he'd catch one ball and run barely any routes because Jimmy G threw 8 times. I don't think anybody was projecting Jimmy G to throw like the 3rd or 4th least times ever in the playoffs and win a football game, dating back to the start of football. So even if you were projecting Jimmy G to throw only 20 times, which would have been very low for coming into that game, you project Kittle to see 5-6 targets in that spot on a good day, not just 1 target or 2 targets on the 8 dropbacks. So again, I'm not going to project 8 pass attempts for Jimmy G here and 8 dropbacks. I'll probably project somewhere around 20, 24, maybe even a little bit more than that, depending on what this Tevin Coleman news is, which does make me like George Kittle. Now, he will still be a blocker, but for a guy that's seeing close to 28% of his team's target share in a game where your quarterback drops back 24 times, you're still going to see 6 targets or so. 8,400, that does seem steep to pay for, but you start to drop off a pretty big cliff here in terms of upside, especially with the red zone upside that Kittle has on this showdown slate. So at 8,400, I do like Kittle. Jimmy G at 8,000, there's going to be a lot of people that forget that Jimmy G ranked top 5 in passing touchdowns, top 5 in yards per attempt, top 5 in quarterback efficiency during the regular season. And those are some of those stats, like passing touchdowns, include volume passing. So he kind of led this team while they were getting through injuries with Breida and Coleman through the middle of the year. Kittle at one point as well, before they were acquiring Emmanuel Sanders and really working through Dante Pettis and Marquise Goodwin, if you remember the beginning of the year. So although the last 2 games have been very, very run heavy because it's just worked and they got ahead, I do think that there is a way, and we've seen it all season long, how good Jimmy G has been. He's been getting a very bad rep. I think that's maybe an advantage that we have right now, is that people are thinking that Jimmy G is just going to literally hand the ball off 8 more times in this game for one of the most rare outcomes that we've seen since the beginning of football time last week in a playoff game, just 8 dropbacks. So in a spot where Kansas City does struggle against the run, I understand that people are going to mainly think that this is going to be a 18 pass attempt Jimmy G game. And I think that's a possibility as well. But I also think that the amount of ownership that will come in on Jimmy G is going to be so low and low enough based on for what it should be, because people are just going to assume the last 2 games of the playoffs are what's going to happen, and he's going to throw 15 times. Whereas I think there's a just as likely chance that he throws 25 to 26 times, and at $8,000 for $4,600 less than Patrick Mahomes becomes a really good point per dollar option. So Jimmy G right now, I lean towards playing more than I don't, only because I think there's going to be a negative rep on him and an overwhelmingly positive rep on the rushing game, which there should be from what you've seen. But once again, just like last year, Millionaire Maker, it's not always what you expect. And Jimmy G throwing for 30 times and 250 yards and 2 touchdowns, does that seem that wild? No, he did it all regular season long. He's pretty much averaging it. And now you get into some of the wide receivers. Deebo Samuel at 7,600. So if you are going to buy into the narrative that the San Francisco 49ers dominate through the passing game this week, or maybe not even dominate, just overproduce the expectations through the passing game, underproduce maybe through the rushing game, then Deebo Samuel would be my favorite wide receiver to target, not named George Kittle. At 7,600, again, it's a steep price point, but it does drop off a cliff here. So if you have the money to afford Deebo Samuel, I would prefer him over guys like Sammy Watkins, even over his teammate Emmanuel Sanders, who actually comes in $2,400 less. I do like the matchup. For Deebo Samuel, he's going to be on the outside. He'll get a matchup against Bashaud Breeland, who's been playing very well this year for the Chiefs. Ward, who's been playing much better as the season has gone on. But it's still nowhere near the difficulty of what these KC receivers are going to face. So guys like Sammy Watkins, who will primarily run out of the slot, gets to get a matchup against Fuller. And you've seen a lot of Tyrann Mathieu, the Honey Badger, go into the slot. That is a I don't even know what I'm saying there. The Honey Badger going into the slot. I'm talking about the opposite side of this. You're going to see a lot of K'Wan Williams in the slot against, I thought I was still talking about Emmanuel Sanders, but I'm talking about Sammy Watkins, the next guy on this list, 7,000. You're going to see a lot of K'Wan Williams in the slot, which is definitely a tough matchup for Sammy Watkins. Anything in that secondary becomes even harder if Sammy Watkins moves to the outside. You saw the big game out of Watkins last time out, 60-yard touchdown. He does possess that upside. I just think it's much more difficult for him to get to this week. And again, it'll be ownership. We'll see what the projections look like. But right now, I would favor Deebo over Sammy Watkins in really any type of format if you're playing cash for some reason or GPPs. Then it drops off a cliff. You have the backup quarterbacks. You have Tevin Coleman, who's $6,400, and I'm projecting him not to play. So it goes from $7,000 Sammy Watkins to $5,200 Emmanuel Sanders, and then it drops off another cliff. So Emmanuel Sanders is $5,200. He's the only guy in the mid-range that's a position player, right? $1,800 more is Watkins, and then you have a huge drop, $1,000 to the kickers in Buckner, and then $1,200 to Robbie Gould, the 49ers kicker. And then it drops off again. It drops off even more after that to $3,600 the 49ers defense. And then you finally get another position player, Kendrick Bourne, at $3,400. That is an insane tier of salaries. You know what that means? 1, not a lot of value. 2, a lot of guys priced up when there's no mid-range. And 3, Emmanuel Sanders is a very interesting option in this mid-range because, well, in terms of position players, he's the only one in the mid-range. So I'll go through this again. 7,000 and above, a ton of guys. $5,200 is Emmanuel Sanders, then the kickers, then a defense, and then Kendrick Bourne, the slot wide receiver for the 49ers. So I'm very curious to see what the ownership comes in on Sanders. You might by default just get Emmanuel Sanders over-owned because if you have $6,000 left, you can only afford him. There's nobody else in that range. If you have $6,500 left, and let's just assume Tevin Coleman is out, you literally can only afford Emmanuel Sanders. There's nobody left in that range. So I think that there's a really interesting game theory spot here that Emmanuel Sanders just by default might go over-owned. Think about it. If you have $6,000 left, are you going to play Emmanuel Sanders at $5,200 or a kicker at $4,200? I think a lot of people are going to, want to play Emmanuel Sanders, and I would too. He has more upside for touchdown, upside targets, and he's just a lot more expensive, so people don't like leaving money on the table. With that being said, I think he's fine because he is the only option in that range. But keep a very close eye on some ownership projections, and we can discuss them both on Patreon in my closing thought show before the Super Bowl for the Showdown slate. You can get Patreon. I'll link it up right now above if you're interested. But then also we can talk about it over on the Final Thought show next week around this time, maybe next Thursday or so, maybe next Friday. We can talk about the Final Thoughts on YouTube here and what his ownership is starting to look like because I have a feeling it's going to be higher than it should. The kickers, as always, my disclaimers, I think they're both fine. You can get the both of them. You can try and predict game theories and see which kicker you want to go to. Doesn't seem like the game where both kickers are necessary, but neither did last year, so I think both are fine. I would roster at most one once again. 49ers defense at $3,600. I think you're going to get 35 to 40 attempts from Patrick Mahomes in this game if I had to just fire a number off the top of my head in a tough matchup. With a good pass rush and a quarterback dropping back a lot and a guy who likes to target his players downfield, there's always a possibility of turnovers, always a possibility of sacks, and then points scored from the defense. So I do prefer the 49ers who have the better pass rush, have the better secondary, better overall defense. Going to face a team that's probably going to throw more times than not in the Chiefs against them than their team, the 49ers offense, is going to throw against the Chiefs defense. So I do prefer for 3,600 the 49ers defense over the Chiefs. I think both are in play. Matt Breida at 3,200 becomes a lot more interesting to me once Tevin Coleman news breaks. If you were going to project, say, 30 rush attempts instead of the 42 that I think you've gotten 2 weeks straight now to the 49ers, say you're going to project 32 rush attempts in this game, you say they throw a little bit more. I think that you can confidently project 16 for Mostert, maybe around 10 to 12 for Matt Breida, 4 to 5 for Jeff Wilson Jr. if Tevin Coleman was to be out. And at 3,200, if you're going to get somewhere around 10 to 12 touches out of a running back, I think, especially in a favorable spot, I do think it's in play. And especially when you factor in that Matt Breida, probably when he's healthy, one of the most underrated pass-catching running backs in the entire league. At 3,200, that seems like one of the better value spots on the slate if it does indeed break our way that Tevin Coleman is ruled out. $3,000 for the Chiefs defense. They are improving with their pass rush. They are improving with their running game and their secondary. All that's improving. It's nowhere near as stout as the 49ers. Do I think it's in play? Yes, because they're 3,000. There's not a lot of value, and we've seen fluky things happening, especially if you're going to force Jimmy G, and they actually can stop the run, force Jimmy G to throw outside the numbers more. This defense is opportunistic, so I do think they're in play. Finally, the rest of the Chiefs receivers into Demarcus Robinson and Mecole Hardman. I prefer Hardman at 2,200. Seems like one of the better value plays in the slate. The problem is Robinson's going to run around 20, 25 routes in this game, maybe even more. Hardman's only been running like 10 routes per game in the playoffs. The problem is, though, also that Robinson's targets are like 6, 7 yards downfield. Not too much downfield in terms of burners. That's where you're getting a lot of Tyreek Hill targets. Whereas Hardman's are mainly downfield, or they're trying to prioritize him on when he is on the field. If he runs 10 routes, he might see 4 targets, might touch the ball 2 or 3 times on end arounds. He is also involved in the special teams, the kickoff return game, so that's another little bump for him as well. I do prefer Hardman to Robinson. Robinson will be on the field more times than not, about 2 times as much. But in a matchup against a very good defense, you might see Hardman more involved in some of these gadget-type plays. You might see them run more 4 wide receiver sets with 2 slot receivers. You don't see that out of the Chiefs a lot, so I do think it's interesting. So those are 17 players that I have interest in, factored by price from Mahomes all the way down to Hardman. Tevin Coleman I haven't read. He's at 6,400. If you told me he was active, I would start to have some interest, but right now I don't think he's going to play. Kendrick Bourne I'm going to put as a no for right now. He's only 3,400. Again, you could argue with me on this Showdown slate. How do you have him as a no? And I would say, okay, yeah, I mean, he could be in play if you want him to be. I'm just trying to X off some names here. He's a guy who I think runs around 16 routes or so if they start to throw more. If Jimmy G's only going to throw 20 times in this game, Kendrick Bourne's going to run about 8 to 10 routes. If Jimmy G throws 30 times, he'll run about 14, 15, 16 routes out of the slot in a matchup. Now, here we go. Properly against Tyrann Mathieu, who's been playing a lot of slot cornerback, and it's a brutal spot when Tyrann Mathieu's not in the slot, which I think they will actually prioritize him in the slot on a lot of these plays, especially in the red zone where they like to target Kendrick Bourne. I think you end up seeing a lot more Kendall Fuller on Kendrick Bourne in between the 20s, but even then, Kendrick Bourne's average depth of target and his air yards per target is like 5. It's terrible. So at 3,400, Kendrick Bourne, if he's not scoring a touchdown for you, and you get the upside of the 49ers throwing the ball more, then you probably have a situation where Kendrick Bourne sees 2-3 targets, 2-3 receptions for 20, 25 yards. And if there's no touchdown, 3,400 doesn't do much for you. Darwin Thompson should touch the ball a little bit more since McCoy was a healthy scratch last game. Even then, I don't think he touches the ball. Sees more than 5 snaps in this Super Bowl. LaShawn McCoy was a healthy scratch from the last round, not somebody I'm too interested in. Kyle Juszczyk, this time last year, he was one of the best players in the Pro Bowl. He had like 5 receptions, over 10 fantasy points as a dirt cheap player, very similar price as he is right now. But in this week, he's going to be a guy who I think draws some ownership, and I think he draws a lot more buzz than he deserves to. So I guess this is for the fan share sports and all that. If they end up quoting this for a buzz, I think it's a negative buzz on him because, look, he's $1,200, but he's not $200. He's a guy who runs about 8 routes per game. 8 routes per game when they throw a lot. Otherwise, he's heavily involved in the running game like he should be. So his 8 routes per game when he's the last read on these plays, and they don't really prioritize the plays with him much anymore as they did in previous years, you might get 1 target in this game for him. You might get 1 to 2 rushing attempts at most. For 0 to 3 touches for a fullback whose overall upside per touch is what, on average 5-6 yards at $1,200 is expensive. At $200 I would have some interest because then it just takes your 1 yard plunge of a touchdown. Like at $1,200, if Kyle Juszczyk, if this game is just not like a 7-3 game, and Kyle Juszczyk has 1 touch for 1 yard and a 1 yard touchdown and finishes up with 6.1 points, at $200, that might be needed. There's a good chance it is needed. At $1,200, it's much different. It's 6 times the price, and you're not getting anywhere near the return on that. 6 fantasy points from a $1,200 player, you might think is an automatic lock to be needed. It's not. If it's a very low-scoring game and there's not a lot of point scores at all, well, then, yeah, it starts to become maybe needed. But if this game ends up being 24-17, Kyle Juszczyk 6 points, whether it comes via touchdown, whether it comes via 3 catches for 20 yards, probably are not going to be needed if I had to guess. Blake Bell at 800, no real interest, backup tight end for the Chiefs. Do like him. Really, honestly, Travis Kelce Jr., but no real interest. Richie James Jr., not running a lot of routes, mainly just a special teams player. I left him on this list just because he will touch the ball, whether it's in special teams or on offense. Just no interest. So that's 24 players that I think are in play. I ended up putting 17 of them as interests of mine. Tevin Coleman and LaShawn McCoy were waiting to see their statuses. Will LaShawn McCoy actually get to play in the Super Bowl? I don't know. Will Tevin Coleman's shoulder be healed in the next 11 games? or 11 days. I don't know. That's where I'm at right now. Hopefully this helps. I will have this more in-depth and detailed next week with some yeses, rankings of all of the plays that I have in interest of point per dollar wise, projection wise. We'll do a closing thoughts video on Super Bowl Sunday, so you can check that out on Patreon, as well as my projections and my tiers for this slate. And then next week we'll go through some player props that I like for the Super Bowl on YouTube, as well as the final thoughts, do a little bit of video updating you with some notes and a breakdown of each individual player's matchups and where I come in as of next Thursday or Friday on these guys. Thank you. Be sure to hit the subscribe button. Be sure to check out my Patreon exclusive content linked up down below. You can also click the little eye above. It'll pop out a sidebar. Click the Patreon icon. Take you there. You can check out what's over there. And check out Fantasy Draft linked up down below. Again, rake-free fantasy. If you do want to check it out, use that link down below. It does help me out, even if you just want to click it to help me out. But thank you so much. My name's Sal. I appreciate you all tuning in. Best of luck and have a great rest of your day. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed that video. Above my head, if you're not already subscribed to this channel, I do ask you if you can please hit that subscribe button. Helps me out a good amount to reach more people. You can also follow me on Twitter. That's over there. Right in the corner is my @SalVetriDFS Twitter. And then above, you'll find my Patreon link. You can click on that if you want more exclusive content for me. Or a video is going to pop up, so why don't you check that one out as well. I think it's going to be beneficial for you. Thank you so much again for tuning in, and I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day.